everybody. Welcome to Moms on a Mission. Today's show is sponsored by our good friends at MyPillow. MyPillow makes the very best pillows, slippers, sheets, and so much more. Go to mypillow.com and use code MISSION at checkout and save up to 66%. That's mypillow.com, code MISSION. And we would love to hear from you. Email us at moms@momsonamission.net, and please follow us on your favorite platform.
Today, we are honored to speak with a scholar who has spent countless hours researching the origin of American education and has shockingly uncovered a legitimate, intentional, systematic, progressive heist to strip our beloved country of our Judeo Christian foundation. He is the co-author of the best-selling book, Battle for the American Mind, in which he exposes the 16,000-hour war for the hearts and minds of our children while heralding the combat strategy of classical Christian education. Please welcome to Moms on a Mission, Mr. David Goodwin.
Hi, Dr.
It's
Goodwin.
so good to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin.
Mr. Goodwin.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Goodwin.
I think you should be a doctor by now, right?
A doctor of classical Christian education.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I presently work for the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and I publish a magazine called The Classical Difference. But I did this project with Pete Hegseth at Fox News on both the Miseducation of America, which is the documentary version of it, and as you mentioned, The Battle for the American Mind, which is the book. This was based on research I did during the years that I was a headmaster of a school in Boise, Idaho, called the Ambrose School. I had left a career in technology to work on that when my children were very young, in fact, before they actually were in school, because I kind of stumbled into the idea of classical Christian education, realized its potential and how much bigger it was than I had imagined, and wondered how in the world no one knew about this. So I started to research it, and that's what became the book.
Wow. And so you were not really a teacher per se. You were in what field before you opened?
I worked in technology. I was in product marketing for Hewlett Packard, the computer firm in the 1990s.
Okay. And so you just realized by sending your children to school that something was off with their education.
Sort of. My children never actually went to public school. I had gone to public school myself. And then in my early 20s, I had worked with youth groups in churches and was concerned that the students seemed, or not the students, the kids who were in the youth group seemed like they really weren't able to read or understand the Bible with any depth. And so when I, by happenstance, ended up running into a group of guys that were starting a classical Christian school, I thought, rigor could be a good thing. It would be nice to actually have, kids graduate with some strengths in the reading and what have you. But it turned out that I was completely underestimating what I was getting into. I did not realize the backstory of education in America and how confused I was about it.
And so that's kind of what pushed you to write the book then, just your experience with the kids and.
Yeah, the book, the immediate impetus was that I had attended when I began running a school. Obviously, I didn't know a lot about running schools. I was working in the technology industry. So I started to attend lectures and read books and try and learn what I was supposed to be doing, I guess, as a career. And I happened upon a professor from Hillsdale College who gave a lecture where the progressives were in dialogue. That's what the article was from the 1916 time period, and they were talking about how parents should not be basically in control of what they called the plasticity of the child, which of course is taking a child and teaching it what to believe and Christianizing, or teaching the gospel to the children. That was something that the progressives set out to end, and we're still seeing this. I mean, it's not been just a few weeks since the president's office has said that the children are not the parents'
Right.
to do with what they want. They want to take them from us and give them to government.
Yeah, and this probably leads really great to our next question. And in the book, you reference the Greek word paideia, and we wanted to ask you and want our listeners to understand, what does that mean, and how did our forefathers obtain it, since you can see it so prominently in our nation's founding documents?
Well, it's one of those things. It's kind of like, imagine trying to figure out what you look like without a mirror. There's just no it's very hard to understand the concept of paideia, because we all think that we just are the way we are. We don't realize that it's something that's built into us through enculturation by our society and our parents. And the short story on paideia was that obviously it's so transparent, most people don't realize it's there. But the Greeks back, 300-400 BC, they were more introspective, and they were trying to figure out why a child could be taken out of one tribe and moved to a different tribe, and they would grow up, if they were a baby when they were moved, they didn't grow up to be like their parents. They grew up to be like the new tribe that they were placed in. And so there was this estimation that really what it was that you were enculturated as a young child into what you believed in some of the core tenets. So if you happen to be, for example, at the time, Persian, you saw the Persian emperor as the king. You saw him as some kind of god who couldn't be questioned. You were trained to do what you were told. Everything was kind of fixed for you. And the Greeks had this idea that possibly democracy would be a way that you could actually govern a people, but they were quite sure that as long as the people being governed had a servile, what they called a servile, meaning a servant's paideia, who were trained to just do what they were told, they couldn't self-govern, because a tyrant could easily persuade them to vote for him. And so they set out about creating an educational form that could actually structure a student into a citizen who could think for themselves and make judgments for themselves. And this was the Western paideia that was developed, in Plato's school in Athens, and then it was later Christianized. And so paideia is essentially this thing that everybody has, but if you're intentional about paideia, you can create free citizens, and that's been the history of it. Now, it worked for a while in Athens, worked for a while in Rome. It worked arguably a little longer here in America, because by that point, Christian education had been educating a Christian paideia, which is a Western Christian paideia, training students to think for themselves, training them about virtue and goodness, what beauty is. That was all done from about the 5th century AD until just 100 years ago. And then the progressives decided they didn't want us thinking for ourselves anymore, and they changed the whole thing.
I love the point you made that everyone has a paideia. You may not recognize it. And I think that's one of the things when I read the book, that word really stood out to me in Miriam about paideia. We didn't really understand the word, which I don't think many people do. So I thank you and Pete for, defining it for us, helping me to pronunciate it correctly, but just really to take ownership of paideia and what we want our children's paideia to be.
And also, I think it's brilliant for you to expose the fact that, and I think we know this, but you just wrote it in black and white and defined it, that the plasticity of the child. I mean, I believe that this aligns with the word of God when it says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. I mean,
Yep.
Even Jesus knew that if you get to the heart of the children, you get to the heart of the family, and then subsequently the heart of the nation. And so I mean, even back then, I mean, God knew. And so, and I think that's, obviously the battle for our soul. It's not, a political thing. It's good versus evil. And that's the bottom line.
Yes.
Well, tell us how the progressive heist of our country's Western Christian paideia began. We read back in the book, Columbia University was one of the first places where we saw, come over from Germany to start changing our schools. Maybe it goes back further than that. Can you explain that a bit?
Right. Well, it does go back further. in the first half of the 19th century, so like around 1840, Horace Mann really started what we can think of as schools. Before that, really the schools that existed were more parent driven. There would occasionally, for example, be think of a village in Connecticut or something like that, and they would some teenage son of one of the village parents would go to Harvard or Yale, which existed at the time. They would get educated. They come back in the summers, and part of their job to make money was to train the children. So they would help start a little homeschool thing, and kind of train. They usually fifth grade up, because the moms trained how to read, and they used the Bible, and they used some great books like Plato or some of the Luther, some of the great Christian writings, and so it was a much more haphazard sort of education, but it was a good education, because just because something isn't 7 periods a day with a bell ringing doesn't mean that you aren't actually. And in many ways, it helps you get to the heart of the child a lot better than if you overstructure things. So, anyways, that's what education was. Horace Mann went to Germany in this time period, 1840 to 1860. He had gone to Germany, and as the Germans are wont to do, they had structured a bunch of kids in a classroom. You see that in the Miseducation of America. One thing you had said before we went on air is that there's stuff in the Miseducation of America that's not in the book, and it's good. John Case, the producer of that video series, actually did his own research and brought up some great video of some of these German classrooms with the desks in the rows and what have you. And so Horace Mann thought, this is the way we're going to make America great. I mean, he was the original Donald Trump, I guess you could say. The Make America Great, there was no again to it, right? He thought that making America great was going to be about making great schools. And so he brought back these kind of rows and structures. And now he's also bringing back a lot of the German zeitgeist. I like that word. I use it some in the book and in other places. It's something sort of the spirit of our age, or how the culture was the winds of culture were blowing. And the winds of culture in America were, hey, we're a growing nation. We're becoming a new kind of ideologically based nation, not so much of a nation of a particular people group, but a nation of ideas. And so we need this school system. So he brings it back and starts circuit riding, trying to get these schools started all over the place. And by 1860 or so, he'd done pretty much that. There were schools all over the United States. And by 1870, after the war, these schools pretty much had gained the endorsement of many of the states at that point. And so not only were they growing in that capacity, but after the war, with all of the land in the West, there was a decision to create what are called land grant colleges, where they give large tracts of land to support colleges around the country. Every so many sectors in the of these states were given over to education, and the proceeds from them went to fund education. So suddenly college was available to a lot more people than it had been. And these schools that Horace Mann had started were now the essential training ground for students going into these colleges. But remember that up until about 1900, these colleges all were still patterned after the old classical Christian type of school. And one of the features that people are surprised about is that nearly every college in the United States, and that is not an overstatement, their exams to enter the college were actually in Latin or Greek. So for you to get into the college, you had to not only be fluent enough to know Latin or Greek, but you had to be able to take a test in it. And so that was because the classical heritage had always required that. And so right around 1890 to 1910, John Dewey, who's really considered the father of modern American education, decided to take the American educational system in a whole new direction.
Yeah, didn't he say? I remember. I can't remember if it was a book. I've watched that Miseducation America so much.
So good.
The book, excuse me, so much. But didn't he say that he felt like the liberal arts, the grammar, rhetoric, logic was just too difficult for the children to learn, and so he wanted to take that out because he just thought it was too hard on them to learn that.
That was part of it. Most of why he wanted to get rid of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, ironically, and I don't even know if he knew this. He was a very smart man. He probably did. The paideia he wanted to create was a servile paideia. Now, he put it differently. What he said was, we need to train workers for the factories, because the vast majority of these children are not going to be going to college and becoming statesmen. That's for very few, and those very few can go to private school or whatever. But we want the 99% of kids in this country to go into the factories and get jobs. And so he changed the focus of the school system to that. Now, it's not, in the book and in the documentary, you have to paint with something of a broad brush. Obviously, Dewey said a lot of complicated things. He was a very complicated man. But in general, that was his effect.
Sorry.
Yeah, it was just that we don't need to train statesmen. We need to train workers. And of course, when you think about it in the terms I've just said it, he just inverted what the Greeks had done 2,000 years earlier. And basically, and this is the thesis of the book, if there is one, that he undid the very thing that makes civilization, namely Western civilization, work.
Right. So, like they wanted children to be able to think for themselves. They didn't want them just to be stonemasons and just, do their job, but they wanted them to think for themselves and know, why are we here? What is a human being? And those deeper questions of life. And now we've just gone back and we just stripped that, all that the Greeks, gave to us and handed to us, that discovery. And we just stripped us. And I think that is what is so astounding to me. It's like our system wasn't broken. You know what I mean? But it was, in their mind, if you wanted to strip away the anchor and the tethering of the word of God and the divine and seeking the divine instead of seeking this utopia of secular humanism and trying to achieve perfection, as a human versus seeking, the perfect one, God Almighty.
Yeah. And something I thought I'd like to highlight is that you give a specific example in Gary, Indiana, of a project that, kind of gives us really face-to-face what was going on with real details and examples. Can you talk a bit more about that? I've actually driven through Gary. It's a very sad place now. I've driven through there several times. It's desolate, ghost town is what it looks like to me. And I know that's been a while back, but could you go over that a bit?
Yeah, we actually wanted to film there for the documentary and were unable to because of the crime in the area. But the school in about 1905, 1906 that was started there in Gary, Indiana, was started because that town was actually built up as an industrial town. It wasn't, most towns start with a cluster of houses and then they kind of build into a town. This was a manufactured town, Gary, Indiana. And so they had the opportunity to build a brand new school system. The progressives were a lot more organized. This is what surprised me in the research. I had anticipated that John Dewey was a thinker. He threw some thoughts out there. Somebody did this, somebody did that, and pretty soon, poof, you've got the American public school system. But it was orchestrated. They were working at it from every corner. I tell the story sometimes that when I went to the library the first time, my investigation started out with a rather naive belief that, the progressives had a lot going on in the early part of the 20th century. They were dealing with child labor and trying to get, unions created and all this. They probably didn't have a lot of time to talk about education. So this article that talked about the plasticity of the child should have been fast and easy to find. And what I got bogged down in pretty quick is in this pile of magazines from 1916 to 1925, there were tons of educational references. They had an entire agenda around education. And one of those agendas was to create these model schools. There were several. Gary is one of the most famous because a lot of what was done at Gary got adopted into our high schools in America. But Gary was a progressive model school. William Wirt was the head of the school, and he actually had studied under Dewey. I think it was at the University of Michigan after Dewey left Columbia. And so this was an orchestrated and organized attempt to see what would happen if you could build a purely, quote, American school. And again, the thesis of the book, the thing you quickly realize is that they replaced Christ, they replaced Christianity in schools with America, God, kind of God and country kind of approach, but no Christ, just sort of actually no God either. They got rid of that. Now they were having
nationalism, right? Like nationalism replaced God.
Right. And so what obviously kind of people missed was that nationalism has to be based in something. I mean, it's not necessarily bad to be nationalistic, but you have to have some belief that your nation is on the right side. And really, that's a Christian idea, that there is a right and a wrong, there is a good and a bad. And we've seen now in this day and age what happens when that idea gets lost. But at the time, it was so ingrained in the paideia of people that they didn't fear losing paideia because they didn't think they could. They didn't even realize that it was kind of cultivated into them. They thought that they were just kind of Christian folk. And so the progressives came along at Gary and said, we're going to take the Christian part of education. We're not going to get rid of it. We're just going to set it aside for parents to do after school. And we're going to work in the school day with just secular subjects. And there are no secular subjects. I mean, everything is religious. We're seeing that these days, right? They call it secular, but what they're doing to our children, and I could go into that, but that's beyond what we need to talk about here. What they're doing to our children, the worst religions in history did to children, murdering, dismembering. It's like we're back to where we were, and it took 100 years because paideia works slowly. It's something that generation after generation is hard to get rid of. So in that first generation with the Gary schools, the parents did educate in Christ at home, and they did send their kids to the public school. We saw that happen, all the way up through the 1950s. And then you see the 1960s happen. And the explanation of the 1960s has always been sort of a little, it's like, well, we know the youth culture took over. Well, yeah, that's paideia.
Yeah.
You fail to cultivate into kids a paideia that is Western and Christian, you will get what happened in the 1960s. And of course, since then.
And I remember you talking about this, some people might object and say, well, progressivism has been a good thing. Look at women, they can vote now. Look at the child labor laws. Like there was some good that came out of it, but which those two things were helpful. But I think the concerning thing is the fact that it's not anchored to anything but themselves. So, you can say, today, this is our ideal. This is what we're chasing after. And then tomorrow it will be something totally different. And there's no anchor or tethering to a divine ideal. It's just whatever the whim of the day is.
Yep. No, you're right on. And I mean, we've seen this throughout history. This, go to the Old Testament, go to Adam and Eve, right? You shall surely not die. And she didn't eat the fruit and keel over and die right then. There's always some truth in the lies. And so when the progressives started telling their lies, they had enough truth in it about, hey, it's not good for little kids to be in factories losing arms and legs, in machinery. We need to fix that. You can't have a revolution if you don't have some truth in what you're saying. And so they had enough truth to do that. They made some major changes, but this one in particular was the surprise to me because it isn't talked about in our textbooks. You don't see it in America's public school textbooks. The little green box in the right side of the textbook that has the progressives and, shows the flag and has, the labor unions and what have you, doesn't mention that we took Christ out of the schools.
And I think that's so critical when you think about it. Like they weren't like riding on a horse and advertising like, hey, we're going to take God out. I mean, they just gradually started. Like I believe in Gary, Indiana, they even let the kids go home during school to go be educated. So they were actually giving them time to go. They just weren't doing it. And that was just like the slippery slope, that began. And
And like you said, they use the nationalism way to kind of make it more palatable. Everybody wants to put their hand over their heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing the national anthem and have this nationalism, but it's like the flag became over the cross.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
That's kind of what I pictured. I was actually talking to my daughter about that the other day. It was your book has brought on so many great conversations with
good.
family and children. And, we highly recommend our listeners to read the book for sure.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Well, in addition to the teachers unions, where we've been talking about, Western Christian paideia, what was the final blow to the Western Christian? Was there one thing or a couple of things? I know we talked through a few things.
Well, the funny thing with the Western Christian paideia is that there didn't need to be a final blow, because paideias fizzle out. They don't really don't go out with a bang. And so you watch them decay over time. And of course, by 1950, we'll go to our timeline here. So that, by 1920, the progressives owned the school system. It was easy territory to own. It's like any war you've ever heard about. Occasionally, you'll hear about one of those wars where, for whatever reason, famine or disease, a whole geography was kind of cleared of people. So the enemy just walks right in.
Mm-hmm.
And so once the progressives owned the school space, they could walk right in. And by the 1950s, they turned the American public schools into basically science classrooms, whether it was hard sciences like chemistry and math and what have you, or they turned all of the subjects into sciences like social science. Well, once they turned the subjects into social science, so now history and literature are not history and literature. They are a way of creating a science around social studies. And those sorts of things completely changed the viewpoint of people to be this materialistic, secular view. So you get, we talk about many of these things in the book. I'll just pick on one. Stories, storybooks for children became a way to train them to do things. So you get the Dick and Jane novels, for example.
I read those. I remember Dick and Jane.
I think all of us did. Those are whole word learners. It's a way of teaching reading that doesn't work.
Yes.
It's been proven that, and they know it.
Yep.
Now even the secular people are moving back to phonics. But nonetheless, the Dick and Jane novels are indicative of something else, which was readers, really. They're not novels. Was indicative of something else, which is, let's put the psychologists and sociologists in charge of writing books for kids. So they lost the imagination and the wonder. And we talk about this in the book, the four battlements that were lost. The two, beauty and wonder, are the ones that surprise people, because once you turn everything into a science, the storybooks become bland and dull. And the loss of the 19th century books that, like Pinocchio and The Jungle Book and King Arthur and His Court. And, Disney loved these when he was a child, because, of course, if you look at his life, he was a child in the early part of the 20th century before Dewey had taken over the schools. So he had been in these school, or in these great classic fantasy and just novels of all sorts. So he brings them into the modern age as films, and that's where we get most of them. And of course, I talk in the book about things like The Jungle Book, where he completely destroys the greatness of the work by Rudyard Kipling, who originally wrote it, because he wants to simplify it and make it fun. And so basically, this is a lot of, when you say what was the last nail in the coffin, I would say the loss of great stories. Yes. in our young children. And for moms, that's what I always, if there's anything you can do, go back to the Penguin classics. Penguin publishes most of these from the 19th century, the George MacDonald's books, Princess and Curdie, Princess and the Fairy, the C.S. Lewis books, the great books, Carlotti, is Pinocchio. These books are a little hard to read, and you'll have to read them to your kids if they're, say, between the ages of 5 and 7. But it's worth it. Read to them, and read them over and over again. Don't just read them once, because kids are amazing. they grow each time you read the same book to them, and they like it. You and I've read that before, but kids, it's like, can I have that one again? It's like 50th time you've done, was it Hello Moon or whatever?
Yeah.
Good night, Moon.
Yeah,
Good
yeah.
night,
Good night,
Moon.
Moon. That was Good Night, Moon.
Good
My
night.
kids are older now. It's been a while since I've read that, but yeah. So that's what I tell moms is get your kids into those old 19th century children's stories and let them spend a lot of time in those.
Well,
And the reason, I'll just cover the reason for that for a second. That's where paideia is formed. You asked about paideia, and you
Yes.
asked about what was the kind of the death knell. Well, the death knell of paideia is when the stories are lost, because you grow to love things by the stories you hear. This is why, I always thought it odd that people thought so much of Homer's Odyssey, right? Or the Iliad, the two great Greek works. And the more you get into this in the business, you realize everyone in the antiquity believed that these two books made the West.
Mm-hmm.
And why? I mean, they're just stories, one about a war in Troy and the other about an Odyssey by the name of the book. That's where the term we get. It's formative. Stories form. And that's why it's a mystery how it happens, but that's how you can. And then the Bible is, of course, the source of stories that, as a parent, I probably didn't read the Old Testament to my kids as much as I should have, but that's where most of the good stories are. So by all means, do that too.
Yes.
And I think that I remember when I was in sales, I had my sales manager say, information tells, stories sell. And I think we can get that again from Jesus with all of the, analogies that he was giving, whether it's, the sowing of the seed or, they were so powerful. And I haven't really heard anybody say that, David, but I think that's really good.
Yes. And I just love, it's such a practical thing that parents can do is to look up, the names of these books, and we'll link them to our page and just start reading these books, and your children will love them, even if you have to read them to them over and over. And, it may be hard at first, but take the challenge because it's worth it.
And I want to speak to what you were saying about reading to these kind of more difficult concepts to the younger kids, and what John Dewey said, that they can't, which is a total lie, that these kids can't understand that. And let's be honest, a classical Christian education is rigorous. But I mean, if you set the bar down low, then that's as high as your children will attain. And my son was a sophomore this past year and had English and had to read Dante's Inferno and just several books that he was like, oh, this is so boring. And, but I just knew in that struggle that was so good for him to become, more aware. And I think sometimes as parents these days, our children aren't maybe as thick skinned and as tough as they used to be. And I think that struggle is not only okay, that it's good for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, my son read Dante's Inferno this year. He's 16, and it was a slog for him. It was really hard, and he wasn't real happy about it. But what was interesting to me was after they finished that, they did Paradise Lost, and I had expected the same. But by then, he'd been conditioned to it, and he really enjoyed that book.
Oh,
and so I think that this is what we see is that we have this myth that we want our kids to not have to struggle with things. And it's through that struggle that he grew to appreciate, one reason I thought this was that, of course, Paradise Lost was written originally in English and verse. So it's hard to read because it's in verse and it's in 1600s English. But he got into the groove over time, and that's what kids do. If you force the exposure and encourage them, a lot of what you need to do with the great books is be enthusiastic about them yourself. Part of what I think he had an advantage of is, of course, that's my wheelhouse. That's all I talk about. So for me, he knew I was enthused about these books, and I think Paradise Lost is the greatest book ever written outside the Bible. And so for him, he caught on to that. And that's what parents need to remember is they'll catch you long before you can lecture them into things. They'll catch on to what you love and what you want. far more, they'll find that far more convincing than just telling them that this is a good thing, go to school and do it. So you've got to read the stuff too.
Well, Julie and I actually been talking about that. Like, we want to talk with our kids this summer about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, read that along with them, study that. And you've heard that saying, more is caught than taught, as it relates to raising kids. Like, you can say go to church, but if you don't go to church yourself, then they're not going to do it, and things along those lines. So I appreciate you telling us that, because I've not read that book, and I'm going to read that book this summer with my son, because you're saying it's really important to read. So we're going to do it.
Well, I just, a good point too is encouraging through the struggle. Just because your kids are going through a struggle or a challenge, and I challenge myself as a parent to do it, because I'll see my child having a hard time and wanting to kind of bail them out, but to really encourage them through the struggle, whether that's reading or a math assignment or a writing assignment or a physical thing. Because if you don't, if you're just like when you're training your body, you have to have some breakdown before you make progress.
That's right.
So I think, yes, we're going to be reading Paradise Lost this summer.
Yeah, I think as parents, we apply too much of our own experience to our kids, but we've forgotten what it's like to be kids. And, one of the things I sometimes talk about is that if you take, a patch of dirt between two buildings and you put stepping stones in there, adults will walk on every stepping stone because, we've got other things to worry about. But kids, they try and jump, right? Yeah. They'll try and skip stepping stones. And the reason is to them, it's wondrous and exciting to see what they can do, how far they can get. And we're thinking, look, if I make it to the shed, I'm going to be in good shape, and so we forget what kids are like. And so use that with your kids. Use the fact that challenges is, obviously if the stones are too far apart, they can't make the jump, you'll discourage them. But if you get them to stretch just that little bit where their tiptoes, okay, and this is metaphorical, of course, where their tiptoes are catching the edges of the stones, that's when the kids are going to be most excited and find the most wonder. And that's where American education, this is when we wrote the book, we got to that chapter on those 4 battlements, and it wasn't in the original work. The work had been written. I wrote the bulk of it earlier, and then Pete threw a bunch in. And then the editor of the book actually said, this is all good stuff, but there's really no so what here. Can you do a chapter on that? So that's where the battlements thing came out. And it really caught the editorial team, and they thought, this wonder, who would have thought that classical education was wondrous? But that's what it's about, getting kids excited to jump that extra little bit of distance and learn things that they didn't know they could learn, and find new worlds in books that are much deeper and richer than they're going to find on TV or in their iPads or even in the books that are written today. There's just so much more virtue and wonder and again, it's not the kind of wonder that I think we're told by Disney is kind of like unbridled. You can think of anything you want. You can do anything you want. No, it's not that kind of wonder. It's the kind of wonder that, how did God make this world? And what can I discover about God by looking at this world?
That's so good. That is so
yes.
good.
And we'd like for you to speak on a little bit about classical Christian education, because we know that is a solution. And I know you're at the forefront of that. You've made your career with that for I don't know how many years you've been doing it. But can you tell us a little bit more? I know Pete had mentioned, and I think this is very exciting, and I hope I get this stat right, that classical Christian schools, if you looked at the entire United States, it could be the 16th largest education system or group.
Well, yeah, that's probably correct. The movement's growth is the news story. I mean, we started out, there were no classical Christian schools in 1980. And there was one between 1980 and there are 3 actually that we know of between 1980 and 1990. 90 to 2000, there were, 100 that started, then 200, now we're up to 500. Wow. Parents are starting these things, and it's parents who do it. It's the beauty of it is that I'm always working with parents. I'm rarely working with professional educators, because really when parents roll up their sleeves, they love those kids more than anybody else does. And moms in particular, that's right where your calling is, to train up the children. And so the big story in classical Christian education is just the number of schools that are starting. We had over 130 start last year, which, given that sequence I just told you, people are hungry for it. After sort of the last 3 or 4 years of craziness, a little bit of sanity is appreciated. And I think that when people walk into our schools, if you have one near you, if you go to classicalchristian.org, just all one word, classicalchristian.org, there's a link for schools, and you can look at the maps of schools all around you, and you can find one near you. And I encourage you to go walk in and visit it, even if you don't have kids, because you'll just be like, I can't process this. Kids that are orderly, happy, joyful, excited, they greet you, look you in the eye, shake your hand. It's manners, virtue. It's a place, I think, that I think there's a lot said about comfort food sometimes, and I think our schools in some way are the comfort food for culture. You look and you go, I recognize that, and it's good.
That's good.
Gives us hope.
Yeah.
Gives us hope.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us today here at Moms on a Mission. How may our listeners get in touch with you or follow you?
Well, I do a Substack, davidgoodwin.substack.com. And that's where I write about culture things. Our classicalchristian.org has routing to pretty much everything. That is if you just search classical Christian education online, you'll find us. We're the main proponents of it. So there's a good place. And I'm on Twitter as well. I don't do as much there, mostly on Substack. Like I said, davidgoodwin.substack.com.
Okay. And we would love to continue our conversation with you, maybe on another episode. But right now, we would love for y'all to go and buy. Oh, can you see it now? Okay. Battle for the American Mind. It's on Amazon. I believe it's almost half price on Amazon, but you also could go to battleforamericanmind.com. Find it there too. You can also get it on Audible. I know moms are busy with laundry, you're driving, you're at pickup, and sometimes you can't, read. I know for Audible works really great for me. And I believe Pete's the one reading this.
Pete read it on Audible, and I listened to it last weekend because I was going to do a speech and figured I ought to remember what's in the book. And he does a phenomenal job of reading books. I'd want him to be my dad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, he has 7 kids, right? So he's really good at practicing the father thing.
There's a lot of reading at home.
Yeah.
Yes.
Reading time. Right. So please order that book today. I promise you, really, that's the reason why we're doing the podcast is we both read that book and our minds were absolutely blown. And we said, how did we not know this? How are we 53 and 54 years old and we didn't know this information? And I'm telling you, it will change you'll change your life.
Once you read it, you can't unread it, and you've got to take action. And that's what we're about here, is educating people and awakening them to the truth, and then activating them do something. And maybe you'll be someone out there that wants to start a classical school, and Moms on a Mission wants to be supportive of that endeavor. With the more classical schools we have and our moms homeschooling, we want to be a hub of support for that. So David, we thank you so much for joining us today. And like we said, we'd love to continue the conversation maybe on another day, or check them out on Miseducation of America. They have such great interviews on there with Carol Swain and many others that really.
That's on Fox Nation. So it's a subscription service online. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, audience, we would love to hear from you. Let's get connected. Just go to our website at momsonamission.net and fill out your information. That's momsonamission.net, and email us with your comments or questions about Battle for the American Mind or anything else you have heard on our podcast at moms@momsonamission.net. That's moms@momsonamission.net. And please follow us on your favorite platform. Moms on a Mission is excited to partner with our friends at MyPillow. According to sleep experts and sleephealth.org, over 50 million Americans struggle to get a good night's rest. That's where MyPillow comes in. They make the best pillows, sheets, mattresses, and mattress toppers. Several years ago, I was having trouble falling and staying asleep due to neck and shoulder pain. Luckily, I heard an ad about MyPillow and decided to give it a try. After 3 or 4 days, I really began to feel a difference. I was sleeping better and my neck and shoulders felt so much better. MyPillow really does help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. Moms on a Mission wants you to get a great night's rest too. Go to mypillow.com right now and use the promo code MISSION for up to 66% off your purchase. MyPillow products are made in America and have a 60-day money-back guarantee and lifetime warranty. Remember, go to mypillow.com, put in the special code MISSION for your special Moms on a Mission discount. Thank you and God bless.
Hey guys, it's Moms on a Mission here. Are you worried about your financial stability and protecting the money for which you work so hard? The problem is stock market volatility and inflation. You may be wondering what you can do to preserve your family's wealth. We at Moms on a Mission encourage you to reach out to our friend Andrew Sorcini with Beverly Hills Precious Metals. Andrew is the expert in educating you to help you find the right balance of gold and silver for your family portfolio. He made it so easy for me to add precious metals to my financial investments. I simply mailed a check to Beverly Hills Precious Metals and my silver showed up on my doorstep a few days later. It was so easy. Go to bh-pm.com to save a little money and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you. That's bh-pm.com. Don't wait. Protect your wealth today by going to bh-pm.com and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you. Hi everybody, it's Moms on a Mission here. Recent research from the CDC says that millions of Americans develop parasitic infections and symptoms often go unnoticed or are misdiagnosed.
Parasites are the cause of many health problems, such as anxiety, depression, chronic pain, fatigue, and unexplained digestive issues. We all need a common sense strategy to improve our health.
We at Moms on a Mission encourage you to reach out to our good friend, Dr. Jason Dean. Dr. Dean's Full Moon Protocol provides all natural detoxification and fights inflammation. These supplements are made with 100% organic ingredients and are proven to kill parasites safely and effectively.
To order your Full Moon Protocol, go to bravetv.store/mission to save $20 off your first order. That's bravetv.store/mission. Order Full Moon Protocol and start killing those foreign invaders that have been keeping you sick. That's bravetv.store/mission to receive $20 off your first order.